We were constantly poking and prodding and digging and trying to get as far into Chinese society as we could. I would sort of break up what I did in China into a number of different kind of periods. When I first got to China, mid-'80s, to open the CNN bureau, for most Americans, China was still almost like going to the moon. It was still so different, so alien, so isolated, even with a dozen years or more of contact, albeit limited. And so the first year or two I was there, I did an awful lot of stories about just what is life like for ordinary Chinese. How do they eat? How do they go to school? How do they raise their kids? What are their recreational things? Because just kind of humanizing China, which was in many ways still such a remote, misunderstood country. I think I probably would have been able to do a better job and go deeper had the constraints not been there, but I think the approach would have probably been the same. Then there was Tiananmen Square in 1989, which was dramatically different from that earlier period in many, many ways. Both the nature of the story, the window that it provided into tensions in Chinese society that we knew were there but could kind of never put a finger on, and then, of course, the crackdown and the restrictions which followed. And then in the early mid-'90s, when Deng Xiaoping jump-started the reform program, the focus shifted again into sort of China's revival of economic reform and what this meant and what this was doing to people's lives. I always tried, when possible, to sort of bring it down to an individual, to illustrate bigger themes through what individuals were doing, which was tricky in the sense that it's very hard to generalize about China, and it's such a complicated, paradoxical place that I always thought I would people would ask about, why didn't you do this or why didn't you do more of that? And my response was, this is like a giant mosaic, and each story is one piece of a bigger mosaic, and you can't judge the totality on the basis of one piece, but it's a cumulative effect, because given the limitations of the medium, the fact that you're doing 2- and 3-minute stories in an all-news format, you can only do so much. I think the picture that Americans get of China today is not adequate. It's partly because of what's happened to the news media themselves. The crisis in the mainstream media has meant that there are fewer news organizations with the resources to keep people in Beijing. I think the organizations that have people in Beijing, I think those reporters do, on balance, a very solid job in an extremely challenging environment with a very, very complicated story. But the impact that kind of coverage has, I think, is limited because the impact of the mainstream media is limited. There are fewer newspapers. The major television networks, I think, have almost completely dropped the ball on China. If you look at the major big three networks and the cable networks, you see almost nothing on China once in a very great while, and very, very rarely do you see anything that addresses the sort of multi-layered, complicated, paradoxical nature. It's either a hard news event, a train crash, or something connected to the broader U.S.-China diplomatic agenda, the Chinese currency, and so on. And so I think for most ordinary Americans who get their impressions of China from the media, they're not very well served, despite the efforts of the reporters on the ground in Beijing, who I think are trying to do a good job under tough circumstances. In fairness, I think one has to acknowledge that overall the conditions for the foreign press in China today are vastly better than they were when I lived there, in a great many respects. You can choose where you want to live. You have much more freedom to hire your local staff. It's not just handed to you by the government, and that they're not all government spies as their primary job. There are much fewer restrictions on where you can travel. China itself is a much more open society, and so you have resources to learn about what's going on in the society, such as the internet, microblogging services. More Chinese are less uncomfortable about interacting with foreigners because it's more accepted now than it was. So I think in many ways it's much better. You can get on a train or a plane from Beijing and go almost anywhere and try and do whatever you can. That being said, I think the political atmosphere in China is very uptight at the moment, and so at an official level there's a great deal of anxiety. And I think it also is, to some degree, there's a kind of disconnect between what the more sophisticated people in the central government who have a better sense of what works with the Western media and what doesn't, and local officials who are much more suspicious. So I know many reporters who say they go to a town or a village, and the local officials come up and say, "Why are you here? You don't have permission to be here. Go away." Give them a hard time. And they pull out the foreign ministry regulation that says we're entitled to travel. I know people who have called the foreign ministry and said, "Tell these local folks it's okay." So the acceptance across the country is very, very uneven. And it's an authoritarian political system, and journalists, Western journalists, come from a tradition that your job is to shine a light into the darkest corners of the society, and no society and no established authority likes that. And China, given the nature of its political system, likes it and accepts it even less than a lot of other places. So it's still tough, but I think on balance it's tremendously improved from what it used to be. I think one needs to be clear: the Chinese government doesn't censor the foreign media in the conventional use of the term. I went to Libya in 1986 for CNN. The Libyan government minders screened our tape at the TV station and physically erased the portions they didn't want to send out. That's censorship. That, in my experience, I never had an episode like that. It's always been possible to get your story out. The difficulty in China has been reporting the story, the barriers that have been thrown up to access, people who are not willing to talk to you, government departments that don't want to respond to your questions, sometimes pressure and intimidation being followed, and so on. But I think, in fairness, the authorities are much more sophisticated. They have a bit better sense of what journalists want. You see a lot more briefings and press conferences. When I first was based in China, the foreign ministry would have one briefing a week, and 1 week they would answer your questions, 1 week they would just read statements. So the cynical joke was 1 week no questions, 1 week no answers. But today they're available all the time. There are websites that put out material. Other units are the same way. They're much more proactive. For example, during the unrest in Xinjiang in 2009, it was absolutely fascinating. The Chinese let the foreign media go to Xinjiang. They set up a press center where internet access and filing facilities were created, even though they'd cut off internet access for everyone else in Xinjiang. They let people go out with the security forces and film them as they tried to impose control. And as a result, I think they got much more balanced, from their own point of view, coverage of the Xinjiang unrest than the Tibet unrest in 2008, where, with the exception of one British reporter who happened to be there, they didn't let anybody else in. So they're getting savvier. It's a combination of being more skillful, but also they have their own control mechanisms. But it's often less directed at the reporters than at the people the reporters are trying to cover, the places they're trying to go. Well, I think, in fairness, when I first started going to China in the early mid-70s, if somebody had said to me then, let me sketch out a vision of China in 2011, 2012, I would have thought they were just dreaming. They'd taken too many drugs, were fantasizing. No one could have conceived of China turning into what it's become. I think that's fair to say. I think that's true even much more recently in the aftermath of Tiananmen Square. Who could have thought then that China would be? So we all underestimated the ability of China to change in this very dramatic way. I think we underestimated the ability of the Chinese government to do as skillful a job as it's done in managing the transition. I think one thing that perhaps we interpret it incorrectly. In the late 80s, before 1989, there was a sense that all this that there was a more meaningful political reform process that was likely to take root. And then after 89, when the economic reforms resumed in the early mid-90s, there was an expectation that with economic growth comes automatic political liberalization of a more sort of conventional Western kind. That hasn't happened so far. I think the jury's still out on whether it will happen. I mean, in some respects, the Chinese are going to find their own way, and it's going to be a Chinese way with bits and pieces from elsewhere. But I think there, among many, not just journalists, but foreign observers, there was a kind of expectation that when you have stock markets and private enterprise and international investment and the internet, that you move towards a more pluralistic, democratic political system. And so far, the Chinese have proven themselves very good at having one and preventing the other. And I think people who thought that the two were going to go in tandem, or that the one was going to automatically produce the other, were wrong. So far, at least.